everyone, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on UI elements in Xcode using Swift 3. This tutorial will focus on introducing the new UI element, which is going to be a button. Now, buttons are pretty familiar to us. We use buttons pretty much all the time in kind of any application that we use. And so buttons kind of allow the user, enable the user the ability to interact with the app itself. So before we just saw a label which just displays some text. Now we're going to introduce something that allows the user to change this text. So a button can perform any task, from a simple task such as changing label text to something more complicated such as performing a calculation to something really complicated such as loading an entirely different page. So buttons are going to be included in pretty much all of our apps at some point. They're a great interactive element. And let me show you one right now. So this is just a little example. This won't be what our final product will look like, but basically we have a label up here. We have a button that says press me, so this just says this is some label text. Once we press the button, the text changes to now the text has changed, and we have a little smiley face here. Okay, so this is an example of when we click the button, the text changed. So there we had some kind of an action that we press the button and we have something happening there. Okay, so let's minimize this and let's focus on actually creating something. So we're in Xcode right now. I just started creating a new project. So when I loaded up Xcode, I said create a new project, and again this is the home screen here. So we'll select another single view application and we'll click next. Let's give this a name, and I'm just going to call this button tutorial. And again, same fields filled out as before. We'll just click next, give it a place to save it. I'm just going to save it to the desktop. And there we go, our project is created. So I'm just going to, as soon as this is ready, I'm just going to minimize that a little bit. We're going to close this up and open up the main.storyboard file. And again, we're going to close that side panel, switch to the iPhone SE, and minimize that. Okay, so we're going to follow the same format as we did with our labels tutorial, where we will add a button to our layout here. Then we're going to incorporate it into the code. This time we'll have to add more than just an outlet. We'll have to actually add what's called an action as well. But we'll explain more about that when it comes time to do so. And then by the end we'll have a button and probably a label, some kind of interactive element that will change its value once the button is pressed. Okay, so that's what buttons are really good for. They just can carry out any task that we delegate them to do once the button is pressed, so once a user presses the button. Okay, otherwise enjoy this tutorial. Buttons are really useful elements, so pay close attention and learn to love them. So now we have Xcode fully set up for our tutorial. We're now going to introduce to you what a button is. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what it's going to do. It's just basically going to be an object that when pressed triggers an event, but we'll go into a bit more detail than that. We're also going to add a button to the layout using the main.storyboard simply by clicking it and dragging it and dropping it in. We're also going to, once the button is added, we're going to adjust some of the properties in the properties window. So there are two ways to do this. We can either do it in the code or in the window itself. I'm first going to show you how to do it in the window, and then in the next part we'll look at how to do it in the code. Alright, so we're all set up now. Let's talk about exactly what a button is. So I'm sure we've used buttons in pretty much any device, and they're used in most of the applications that we'll use on a day-to-day basis. So a button basically is an object that when pressed will trigger some kind of an event. Now this event could be as simple as changing text or text color to actually turning on or off your device. Okay, so we use buttons for all sorts of things, and it just kind of, when they're pressed or clicked, it just triggers some kind of an event. Okay, so there are two main kind of parts to a button. There's the part where we can edit the properties, and there's a part where we can handle the behavior of the button. Okay, so when we add the button to our layout, we can only really modify the properties, but when we go into the code itself and add it in there, then we can modify both the properties and the behavior. So the most important aspect of this button is, in my opinion, going to be the behavior, because otherwise it's just kind of a glorified label. So we've talked about labels in the previous tutorial. If you haven't watched that, I'd suggest you go back and watch it. And labels just kind of allow us to display text. Well, buttons can display text as well, and just like a label, they have many properties that we can adjust and change, but they also have this event handler that will also add in. So when triggered, when this event handler is triggered by kind of a button press or something, then we can do some kind of cool stuff within our code. Okay, so that's what a button is. It just kind of triggers some kind of an event when pressed. So the way we're going to add this into the layout is we're just going to select a button here. I'm just going to expand this window up. So we have a bunch of different objects, a bunch of different views that we can add. Last time was a label, this time is going to be a button. Okay, so we're just going to click on it, and it doesn't usually like us doing that the first time, but you see now this screen has turned this kind of light blue, and we have this kind of a green plus circle. So we can put this wherever we want. We can put it at the bottom, the top, at the sides. I'm just going to put it kind of towards the top in the middle for now. And once we release it, then it adds this button to the layout. Okay, so two things have changed. First, we've added the button, and these 8 little boxes have appeared around it. And second, the properties window has opened. Now, these little boxes, as I'm sure most people have seen when designing any kind of a layout, are just to adjust the size. So we can take this and we can make it wider. And again, same thing here. I'm just going to narrow that down a little bit. We can adjust the height if we want. We can even select it and move it around afterwards if we want to do that. I'm just going to leave it there. Okay, so that's what those are for. And now let's take a look at the properties window. So there are a few different things to note up here. The first is going to be this one here, which is going to be the file inspector. Now this kind of just tells us a little bit about what the item that we've selected is. Okay, and if we go to the next one, which is going to be the help, this shows us a little bit of documentation. So it might be a good idea to go ahead and just give this documentation a little skim through if you'd like. But if you don't want to, then I'll try and explain pretty much all of what's on here in the code and in this tutorial. The next one is going to be this kind of class information, the identity inspector. So we're not really going to worry about this too much right now. We're most interested in the next two, which are going to be the attributes inspector and the size inspector. Now the attributes inspector is where we're going to be able to adjust all of the properties. So notice we have type that we can adjust, state configuration, we have the title that we can adjust. So this right here is what's displaying the text. Notice that the text says button right now. If we change this text to something more interesting, such as interesting text, then we see that the text changes here. Okay, so this is how you can change a text in the properties window. We can change stuff like the font. So right now it's under system and we're pretty restricted in what we can do, but if we go to custom, then we have this whole huge list of fonts that we can choose from. I kind of like the Avenir font. If we choose black and increase the size, then it just changes kind of the style of the text. So you see we get kind of a bold text. It's a different font and we made it a little bigger. We can also change a text color if we'd like. So right now it's blue, but we can change it to black if we'd like. I'm just going to change it back to blue because I kind of like that blue color. And we can change stuff like the shadows. We can change stuff like whether or not we can draw on it, and controls, and yeah, so there's lots of different attributes that we can change in here. We can even change a background color if we'd like. So one of the cool things about buttons, and we're not going to cover it so much in this tutorial just because I don't really have a lot of art on this laptop, is that you can change the background of a button to contain some kind of a pretty cool image if you'd like. So you'll see this often particularly in games that you can download on mobile devices. You'll see that buttons kind of have a pretty cool background or a cool image. Well, you can add that in the background. Okay, so again, we're not really going to cover it so much in this tutorial, just because I don't really have any art on this computer. The next thing is going to be the size inspector, and this just allows us to adjust the margins. So I'm not so much interested in the first little panel here, but however, if I look at the view, we can fine-tune the sizing. So we can change the sizing by using the little boxes, or we can do it this way. So if I want to be precise, I might say 20, and the width, I might say something like 280. Okay, and then for the height, maybe I want it at 40, and I want the height to be, let's say 60. Okay, so again, I can fine adjust it this way or coarse adjust it this way. Okay, so that's pretty much all we're going to talk about in this part. I just wanted to show you how to add a button to your layout. Again, just by selecting it and dragging and dropping it. So you have to wait until the screen turns blue and you get this green plus prompt. Okay, otherwise it won't add. And then we can, once the button is selected, we can go into this window and adjust the properties under this section, the attributes inspector, or we can adjust the sizes under the size inspector, like kind of margins and the actual size itself. Okay, so that's how to set up a button in your layout. This next part of the tutorial will deal with how to set up the button in your code. So we're not only going to set up the button as an object, but we'll also add in a handler as well, so that we can actually dictate what behavior the code will take when the button is pressed. In this part, we basically just introduced to you what a button is. So just to summarize, a button's an object or a view that, when pressed, will trigger an event. Now this event could be something simple such as changing the text of an object, or it could be something like turning off your phone or turning your phone on. Some common uses for buttons will be, again, changing text, we'll use that a lot, or triggering events such as handling data. So if we have kind of data input and then press a button, it might handle that and perform some kind of calculation. So we see this a lot in these kind of calculator apps. Okay, so we use buttons in pretty much all of the apps at some point. And what else we did in this part, we added a button to the tutorial, or to the layout, from a list of objects. So we saw previously how to do a label. Now we're looking at a button, so it's the same way, we just dragged and dropped it into the main.storyboard. And we adjusted a few of the properties using the attributes and size inspector in the properties window. So this next part we'll be looking at how to actually add it into the code itself.